Okay, I think things are slowing down a wee bit with people entering, so we'll make a start anyway. I'm conscious of time. Can I just firstly introduce myself? So my name is Peter Hutchinson. I'm currently the Director of Curriculum Reform and Transform Ed Implementation within the Department of Education, and this is our third session now, third literacy webinar that we've had, which follows on from the publication of the literacy framework in December. And these webinars are really intended just to look at specific issues within the framework, specific topics, and delve into them in greater detail and depth, with being led by a practitioner about what it means, what it looks like in the classroom, and just lessons that we can all take depending on what the subject area is. So today we're looking at how we connect phonics with spelling and what that looks like in terms of primary school. And we're delighted that Ryan Leeshan, who's a teacher out of Victoria Primary School in Ballyhalbert, he's going to deliver the presentation. Ryan kindly presented at the Literacy Symposium for us as well in December. And we're keen that he was able to speak to more people about this important topic. Just before we start, I should just mention that the first two webinars that we put out, one on the teaching of the science of reading and the science behind the teaching of literacy, and one on foundational skills through explicit systematic phonics instruction, are both now on the departmental website and can be accessed at the Transform Ed Hub, which has different resources and also has the resources from the Literacy Symposium, which was held back in December. Just in terms of housekeeping, everyone's comes into the meeting with their mics off, just to control noise and things like that. The cameras are off, but feel free to put cameras on or keep off depending what you may wish. Ryan will run through the presentation. If you want to ask any questions to Ryan or to Geraldine, who is working with us closely in the department as a literacy advisor out of St Mary's University College, please do put that into the chat at any stage, and we can either try and answer directly, or Ryan will take questions at the end as well. So look, this is meant to be just an opportunity to run through the process, run through the presentation, ask questions, and learn more both about the framework and the specific topic today. So look, I'll maybe hand over to Ryan, if that's okay. Geraldine, is that okay? Geraldine's going to nod. Okay, she's okay. I'll hand her to Ryan, and Ryan will take us through. Well, thanks very much again for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. If you could just maybe let me know that everything shares correctly before I get stuck in. Here we go. So hopefully that should be visible.
That's perfect. Thanks, Ryan.
Good stuff. Okay, I'll dive in then. So I was just having a chat with Geraldine there about how much I've packed into this. So I apologize, and I don't apologize at the same time for that, because I'm hoping that if I've packed lots and lots into here, it'll enable you, no matter whether you feel quite comfortable in this area or you're quite new to this area, you should hopefully be able to take something from it, something you might be able to go and look into and help the spelling instruction in your school. So we're looking mainly at how phonics will tie into spelling instruction, but also how phonics provides the foundations for more advanced spelling instruction as well, and what that might look like. So, no, not letting me click. That's a good start. There we go. So, first of all here, I talked a lot about this at the Literacy Symposiums. I'm just going to touch a little bit on it, but poor spelling has an emotional toll. It can affect the words children actually will choose to use in their writing. It will damage their writing and their ability to express themselves in quite obvious ways. But also it will damage, it will be damaging them beneath the surface. We'll see some of these errors, and we'll maybe see some of the problems that will come from being a poor speller. But actually it goes much deeper than that. Again, something that I think you have access to my recording of the Literacy Symposium. I go more down that route of looking how spelling can feed into other areas of the curriculum. This one's going to be more a deep dive into spelling and the language itself. So the challenge itself, we use 26 letters. We have over 40 sounds, usually about 44 sounds, depending on the accent. And we are aiming to recognize, by the time we finished our schooling, have a lexicon of about 70,000 words. Depending on where you look, it'll be different numbers, but it's a huge number, and that is the challenge that we face in education. So I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of the English spelling system, and why is it as messy as it is. I've chosen the word messy instead of some other ones that we might encounter later on. So here's a little overview graphic, a bit simplified, but it kind of shows you here how the Spanish language and Italian languages, they can be quite simple in their orthography and their structure. English is not, it's not what we call a shallow orthography, where it's quite simple with the way phonics relates to those letters on the page. It's become very deep. It's a mixture of all these different funny little icons here that are representing invasion, technology, scholarship, various aspects that have interfered with how our orthography works. I'm going to whiz through this. So once upon a time, we go back, over 1,000 years, we are looking at just a system very similar to Spanish or Italian. We basically just used sounds to letters to represent sounds, and that was it. You could pretty much just sound out the word, and every word would be spelled like that. That was it. It was quite a simple system. This would have been the word for king over here. I think pronounced something like kynning, and hus for house. So the sounds have changed, but back then the spelling was very simple. Just write down what you hear. And spelling systems back then were a lot less conventional. They were a bit more variable, but you just basically put the sounds into letters, the end. Then we get these next aspects here of variation entering our language. We get the Norman conquests brought a lot of French conventions, French scribes coming in, and they started to use systems that they were more familiar with, and they started to change some of the spellings, and this damaged some of that transparency between the way we were saying words and the way they were being spelt. It started to introduce a bit of variability. And then, finally, the poor English language, we start to agree on some spellings. And so the spellings start to stick. It's a bit of a, it's a bit inaccurate to say it's a straight line, but they're really starting to settle down, the spellings. And then we have a great vowel shift. And tons of our vowels changed pronunciation, including a lot of consonants as well, slightly. So our poor language was then run through the mill again in terms of that sound to spelling consistency was pulled apart even more. We also have English is known as an international language. We have loads of different words from around the world. We choose, rather than changing them from their donor language, we choose to actually try and keep them as they are and enter the language getting lots of pop-ups on my screen. We tried to leave it using the donor languages spelling systems and their conventions. So that also strains these sound to spelling relationships that phonics does emphasize. Here's a little kind of overview. I've covered a few of those there, but it kind of just shows you there are lots of factors that feed into this language that we are trying to get children to spell with today. There are lots of different layers, lots of different influences over time. If we understand how these things influence the language, which is a long journey and it's an interesting one I've been on myself, it helps to clear up some of this ambiguity and what seems like a crazy language. Actually, it seems like it's what it says here, it's preserving the history. We're actually seeing history through our language, and that's actually a bit more of a beautiful way of looking at it than just a bit of a mess. And in truth, it's kind of a bit of both when you dive into it. But there is a lot more logic than you might first assume when you actually dive into the origins of the language. So here's the big question: Is our language English just too irregular? Is there any point in studying phonics? I've just talked through all those layers, all those reasons why our alphabetic system using letters to record the sounds in our spoken language. I've told you how it's been strained by many reasons. So the answer really here is a yes and a no. We are not using a simple one-to-one correspondence. So phonics will not get us all the way, but phonics is still a huge part of it, and we'll look at that as we go along. It's really important to emphasize here that link that we should not be looking at spelling being separate from phonics in these early years when phonics is, the predominant source of teaching them about how the language works. Obviously, that will expand, and we'll build on that, but we shouldn't be looking at these things separately. Okay, so this study is a very popular one. Hannah et al. Looked at 17,000 words, and they basically said they were basically studying if these patterns of English, these phonics patterns, is it worth us studying phonics anymore? Was kind of the underlying theme of it. Is phonics going to tell us enough about our language, or has it strayed too far from its origins, thousands of years ago when it was a bit simpler? And this is what they found here. They found that actually, bearing in mind a bit of where sounds might become found in a word, actually phonics is getting us pretty much half of the way there. A couple of little rules of when we use which spellings where and that kind of thing, but actually phonics can get us pretty much halfway there. And I'm sure nobody would turn their nose up at getting 50% of the way there to understanding anything. You'd think, all right, well, I'm pretty much, I'm on the track, and there's some other bits that we might need to consider. So then we start looking at words that most of the word is actually quite regular, but we've got part of it that's maybe a bit unusual, an unusual sound to spelling correspondence. And then we have this side up here where we're getting more aspects of the word where we're thinking these don't kind of align with the spellings anymore. And then 4% of the language is described as being truly irregular, and that you can't really match the sounds to the spellings with any real, vigor and effectiveness. So really, the study actually came out and shocked a few people and said, you know what, phonics should still be a really core component of our instruction. It's getting us a lot of the way there. So the advantages of phonics and aligning our spelling instruction with our phonics. It's generative, so we can teach children sounds and they can use them to spell sounds that they've never met. It leverages that fact that we were just looking at a minute ago, that the majority of the language actually does align with those phonic patterns and phonic rules that was at the core of the language many years ago. Even those words that don't align very well with the sounds to the spelling correspondences, there's still, in the majority of them, there are stable elements that we can then take out of the equation, and we'll look at that a little bit more soon. And then it's efficient. It aligns with how the brain works. Another thing that we will look at very soon. Okay, so. Literacy is neural or neuronal. I've heard it said both ways. Recycling. We will learn to speak no matter what we do. That is something. Just put a child in a room in a family household where they're just talking, and that will naturally emerge. It is not the same for reading. Reading requires us to basically hijack parts of the brain that were designed for other purposes and make them work for us, work for the ways that our society has developed, with the wonderful creation that is reading. That's opened up incredible amounts of knowledge from previous generations and that sort of thing. But we need to work for this. We need to have a plan. We need to be systematic. There we go. Systematic. So if we choose to align, our instruction, spelling, phonics, and we choose to try and break down all these aspects to children and tell them in the simplest way we can. It's not a simple language, but we can simplify it by looking for the structure within the language. We actually change the way the brain develops. If we just rely on children to keep guessing and looking at word shapes and trying their best with whatever comes to their head, we actually change the neurons they're using within their brains, and that actually structurally changes how their brain interacts with text. So I'm not sure you can guarantee this was a generated image to emphasize this point. So I'm not sure if it's 100% accurate in that side, but the actual points here are perfectly backed up by research. If we teach children with phonics, and we teach them how the sounds work, and we get them actually understanding the linguistic features of these words and the sounds and how they relate, we actually activate different portions of the brain that are associated with effective reading. We then teach them how they can apply these into new words, and their brain is set up for the future, and it aligns with what we know about confident, effective, skilled readers. If we then look at children who have not been taught in that same kind of manner, their brain patterns and the regions of the brain that they are using are very different to what we would see in skilled readers. They don't get they may not, some children will get this no matter what, but they will possibly not get that idea of how to generalize the words that they've learned into new words when they're treating words as these pictures. The brain is processing these images differently. And that's one of the key things that why we emphasize this phonics start. So phonics is really key, but as I've emphasized here, Hamish was talking about effective phonics instruction in the last webinar, and I'm kind of emphasizing, I'm going to sneak in a little bit of handwriting because that is also vital, but how key this spelling element is in terms of making children develop the understanding they need to be able to do the much more complex aspects of literacy as they grow older, that enduring literacy. So we want this explicit phonics instruction. We want there to be that focus, which generally is driven by reading. We want children to be developing their reading, and that is absolutely essential. But if we actually get children using what they have learnt in their phonics and applying that in their spelling and aligning the two, we cement the foundations for that fluent reading and writing for years to come. So this here, a little bit of research that just kind of emphasized that link between becoming a better speller will enable you to actually read better, which enables you to read more, which then feeds back into the spelling. And it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation where actually, becoming a really good speller will make you a good reader. Improving spelling outcomes has been shown multiple times in research to improve reading. But similarly, and in the converse, the more you read, the better you notice the patterns of the language. So it's a nice cycle, a virtuous cycle. There's research here I've quoted. I had a look at different research at the Literacy Symposium, but basically just emphasizing that when we try and use phonics approaches alone, we get good results, but we get much better results when we align the two. And the reason for that is that spelling is generative. We have to pull that full orthographic representation from our memories to spell a word, whereas in reading we can recognize it and we can maybe guess parts. We don't really want to encourage that, but it's possible for children to guess, based on the syntax of the sentence, what's coming up, or just the context, have a guess. That is taken away from spelling. So it really shows us, are they understanding these patterns that we are teaching them? So it forces them to go to dive deeper into this, and it actually really shows whether children have fully cemented these concepts that we're trying to teach them through phonics, and it helps to cement them in the process. So another little brain image here, basically just saying that when we actually include this motor area, when we get children writing these sounds, saying these sounds, reading words with them, and we connect all these together, we actually form these neural circuits that we see in successful readers. Even you and I, as adult readers, we actually activate this motor area of the brain when we're reading. We actually use this to discern similar letters and actually recognize them at incredible speed. But it comes from, this connection between these different areas. So really important that handwriting, spelling, and phonics all get that connected approach, and they're all working together. I have had a few conversations. I decided to squeeze this bit in. I'm going to go quite quick because there's been a few questions I've had about this, and I know Geraldine has had some questions about this as well. Is there a place for onset-rime in this new framework? Would it fit into the new framework? What does the research suggest? We're trying to structure this literacy as well as we can. So here's my best go at sharing what I know about this, in case it helps other people who are wondering about this. So the idea of looking at onset-rime would be that children with difficulties in phonological processing might find it difficult when you've got st, p, to hold those in their brain in order long enough to be able to blend them. So the idea is that onset and rhyme will reduce the amount of phonological load that they have to remember before blending. So in essence, that idea is super, but it does come with difficulties, and I'm going to highlight some of those. And it's not something I would say doesn't have a place at all, but I'll highlight some of the areas that might just help you understand it a little bit better. So the problem comes then, we reduce the phonological load, but we then say, right, these 44 phonemes-ish that we have to learn and grapple with in the language, we then go off the chart with the amount of rhymes. In order to get children actually reading widely and understanding, we're going to have to teach them lots of overlapping patterns. And if we don't have good phonological, phonemic awareness even, children are going to have to learn hundreds and hundreds of different patterns in order to be able to learn to read. We reduce the cognitive load in one capacity at the point of reading, but we actually make the cognitive task of learning all these onsets and rhymes, particularly the rhymes, we make that a mammoth task that for these children who might be finding this difficult, that might be pointed towards this, might actually have great difficulty with, even more difficulty. So the distribution of the rhymes, it shows that there are a certain amount of the distribution that are useful rhymes. Now, some of these might just be explained very simply by phonics, but there is an increased regularity when we look at rhymes within words. So there is an opportunity that looking at rhymes may support some children's spelling development. It might help them to see a bit more regularity than we get when we're just selecting a certain sound for a certain spelling, for the sound A. We're not really too sure what that might be, but if we say it's ache, it becomes a lot more consistent, and we're going to be potentially using the AKE spelling. So there's a lot more consistency in there, but it isn't quite as simple as that consistency translates into better practice. So really what I would say here is, if onset and rhyme were to be used, and if your school uses a program that has onset and rhyme, it wouldn't replace your systematic phonics. That is the foundations, and really to be able to use onset and rhyme effectively, phonemic skills to be able to recognize some of the overlap between rhymes are essential. So there's a chance that this could form part of an effective spelling program, but I would argue that there's more important things. If we have this systematic phonics foundations, there are more important things we could be moving on to, which I'm about to talk to you about in a moment. So there is a potential that we can, the research is not bad on onset and rhyme. It is statistically grounded, but it isn't quite as generative as systematic phonics, and it's harder to organize. And then I'm going to talk about this guy here, Morphology, when we get those phonics basics in place. Really, I think we should be pushing on to that as quickly as possible, because there's lots to be gained from that. Okay, so that was just a little detour down the onset and rhyme kind of path, just because I know there are lots of teachers using programs and I'm familiar with that. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Okay, so we're back to this idea of the English language. How do we teach it? We said, it could be looked at as illogical, chaotic, dysfunctional, but actually when we've lost some of that sound to spelling correspondence and the phonics has become less useful, not completely, something we need to check out and not be looking at all. It's become something that is useful if we supplement it, and is the foundation to understanding the whole language, but not all of it. We get more of this meaning visibility coming through, where we actually see more meaning in the written word than we do in the spoken word. If I said a homophone like sail, You don't know what I'm talking about, whether it's a sale of clothes or sailing on the ocean. Whereas if I showed you that written word, you would instantly know the difference. So we actually start to get more meaning visible in our language through the way we've ended up. So we need these phonics and that spelling need to go hand in hand. These orthographic patterns goes very, very much hand in hand with this still, because we're looking at orthographic patterns. Where do we see certain letters appearing in words? And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And then we should really be looking at this morphological instruction on top as being something that has a lot to offer. Again, something I spoke about at the Literacy Symposium. I would argue all of this, for the majority of learners, would be a really good way to structure your spelling. And onset and rhyme, personally, I wouldn't have it as part of that. But there is merits in there somewhere if it can be worked into, you know, helping children see some of this orthographic patterns once the graphic and phoneme correspondences and skills are really secure. Okay, so here's an example here about you know, a k sound we hear. There is logic to these spellings that we would use to represent them. If we use the C here, our language, and we would see this in city, very similar spelt, or even just cite, to cite some work, it would soften before an E. So we have these different spellings doing different jobs. They've evolved over time, but it is consistent, and we can help children to see these consistencies when we structure our instruction very, very carefully. And the CK is to do with supporting words to keep the vowels short when we add suffixes on the end. So there's a reason why we have these different spellings and doing these different jobs. Not all of it makes loads and loads of sense. You know, if we could rewrite the whole thing, I'm not sure we'd have it all in there, but it does all have a logic that can be learnt and mastered. So once we get beyond those phonological and orthographic layers, we look at morphology, and we start to see that in these words we see meaning transferred, you know, from sign to signal. The phonological clues in sign would not get us there, but actually learning it with signal would bring out some of those phonological side of things, hearing the sounds that are not present. Magic and magician, we can see how those sounds shift when we look at those word families. So morphology in conjunction with the phonology can explain a lot of our spelling system. So again, here we look at some of these inconsistencies in sound, like busted, snored, kicked. Each one has a different sound, but each one to us, it communicates that we have that consistent past tense meaning, and we recognize that, and that actually translates more than the sounds actually do in these. It represents the meaning more than our spoken language again there. So our system has, once upon a time, if you're interested, these probably, and I'm nearly certain of this, had the same pronunciation. You would have said busted, snored, and kicked. That's my understanding, but the pronunciation's changed. The spelling has stuck. And that is kind of one of the reasons you can hear probably in my accent now. I might be saying a lot of these words different to you might. And if the language prioritized just the phonological aspects, we would all need different spelling systems. But actually, where we've ended up is a system that has sounds and meaning all kind of baked into it. So we see this again here. If we look at heal and health, please and pleasant, divine and divinity, we can easily see, oh, I'm getting a pop up. We can easily see here the meaning relation between these words, even when the sound changes. And that's really powerful for children to talk about the change in meaning in word classes, and also the sounds. How are those sounds changing as the meaning changes? How are the word classes changing? These are all really powerful for children to study, rather than just looking at these as just, you know, random strings of letters and just trying to memorize them. So this is a really important point. This webinar is mainly focused on phonics, and when I've had a little bit of a deep dive into the research, there is evidence to suggest that this morphological instruction, and I'll talk through a little bit more how that might look and some of the phonics instruction soon, but if we have these weak phonological decoding skills and we try to bypass that, especially in our weakest learners, without strengthening it, it limits the gains that we will get from the morphological instruction. It's a mediator. So we need to make sure that we don't try and bypass that phonics stage to get to some of this rich morphological instruction. We need to make sure we address it, and we address it early, systematically, rigorously, and get children's support as early as possible so that we can move on to some of this richer morphological instruction that kind of ties up those loose ends where if we're stuck on phonics, we don't get that full picture. So this is what we're aiming for here. So we are looking to get these deep, robust representations into children's heads. If we're going to get spellings to really stick for them, we need them to be confident with the sounds, syllables included. You know, we need to be looking at teaching children how they might break up larger words into their syllables and syllabify them flexibly. We need to be looking at, obviously, how this all relates to the orthography, the letters that we use to spell words and the patterns that we might notice in them, but also the meaning. And that's where morphology comes in and it does a lot of the heavy lifting. It ties together a lot of the phonology and is often called the binding agent that links that meaning, the letters and the sounds all together. So this is the lexical quality hypothesis, which I quite like, and it's suggesting that we need to think about in our spelling instruction, do we tie these three things together? So I'm throwing lots of theory. I'm going to show you a bit more practical stuff in a moment. Oh, it's not letting me move on. Sorry. Oh. There we go. So we're trying to move away from this visual memorization, you know, just getting children to memorize words. It might work one day. It's very prone to decay. If we manage to get our instruction looking more like this, where we're looking at sounds, the symbols, the meaning, how they all relate to each other, we're likely to get memories that will last the long run. Maybe, you know, memories that are stronger than just that Friday test and then it's gone the next week. That is what we are aiming for. That leads me nicely on to my next point here, that we should be testing children on our spellings. And this is not to say that I am a full fan of the Friday test, because of this factor here. Retrieving information strengthens it. It's a good thing in all areas of learning, not just spelling. But what we find, if we just learn these things once, you know, if we test children on these spellings, we're more likely to see a stronger learning as they recall that information that we've taught them. And we do need to make sure we've taught them it and not just left it to, you know, them to just learn on their own, because they're not really going to understand the structure of the words and the sounds and the meaning. But then if we actually think about this more carefully, maybe we don't need to be testing children on their words once and never meeting them again. Maybe we test them on a few, and then the next week we test them on a few, and we just drip them in again and again and again. Maybe we test them on less words, but we revisit them more often, and we build time in to revisit words. And that's something I've been doing and exploring with my class a lot this year, is just looking at how I can test children. Oh, I've lost the lights in my room. I'll need to pop them on in a moment. Looking at how we can, how we can revisit spellings, not just once, how we can space out our practice, revisit again and again. And every time we recall a spelling, we'll be more likely for it to stay in that long-term memory. If we just do it on a Friday, it could very quickly be gone as quick as it's in there. But these strengthened memories that I just talked about, these are less likely to decay if we've taught it really well. And if we combine that with trying to revisit our spellings more often, come back over them, test them on them, drip them in, they're much more likely to stand the test of time. Okay, so this is the bit where I can try and give you a bit more targeted advice on how these things might look in the classroom. That was a bit more of the theoretical underpinning to why the language is the way it is, where our emphasis should be more broadly. So we do not want thematic word lists. We don't want to be sending Halloween words, animal words, beach words. There is nothing that connects these words. There's no part of the language. It's not emphasizing the phonemic structure of the words. It's not emphasizing morphological patterns. It's not emphasizing where we might use certain sounds. You know, how do we spell k at the beginning of a word compared to the end? It's not really emphasizing any of that. It's not making them understand the generalizable features of the language that we want to be teaching them. So look cover write check is not inherently bad, but if it's used in this structure of here's a load of words, memorize these words, it can be a useful little self-check tool as long as we are doing this on the right here. We are organizing our instruction, our lists by sounds, by patterns, by morphological families. If we're providing them with the information to file this learning as it's going, then look cover write check can be a part of helping that to stick in our memories, helping it to stay in that filing cabinet and not decay away. But this kind of instruction where just words are just given out, learn these, and there's not really a connection between them, is not going to have very good results. We want to be encouraging children to see some of these orthographic patterns. So this is that orthographic layer of when do we normally use these spellings? Obviously, this is slightly simplified. There are other spellings of A that we would use, and this is also slightly, as I've found, moving over to Northern Ireland, accent specific, that these things can sound a little bit different. But these features are still very useful to be analysing side by side, and we want that to be part of instruction. It's these orthographic features, we're saying the sounds relate to the letters, but when, where, how, which parts of the words are all really important. So we want to be doing this kind of sorting activities, and I'll share with you some that I've designed and used myself soon. So we want to be doing activities like this. We want to be segmenting words into their phonemes, mapping them to the graphemes, and checking it back afterwards. So very similar to a look, cover, write, check kind of idea, but trying to encourage where we can children to be thinking about how do those letters relate to the sounds. We're going to get better results if we do that. Visual memory, the problem with that look, cover, write, check is if we're letting children just look at these words as just a big shape or just a big string of letters, they might be able to memorize those string of letters by getting it wrong or right throughout the week. And on the Friday, maybe they've remembered it in the right order. But if they don't understand them, the burden of trying to remember that in the long run with all the other spellings they've learned, they just will not stick. Unless there are those children that everything will stick for, but we're not really talking about our instruction and judging it on those very gifted learners. We want everyone to be able to learn, so we need to create that structure that allows everyone to thrive. So this is ideally what we want to be doing, mapping these sounds to graphemes, as we just said. If there's an irregular part of it, we want children to identify that. We want them to think, this sound here is the difficult one in this word. And then maybe we can then relate that to other words to help them remember it. We can look at patterns between this word and other words that might have the tricky part of the word in a similar fashion. So for example, the word said, we might look here and we don't want children necessarily to be memorizing the whole thing, because actually the this and the d at the end are just perfectly normal. We want them to be looking here. We can give them clues, that this actually would have been probably pronounced very differently in the olden days. We can teach them that this could have been said, like paid and laid, and follow a similar pattern in the language. We can give them little things like that, but also ultimately we want to be getting children to narrow in on which part of this word is tricky when they're spelling it, as opposed to this is a tricky word. We want it to be looking at a tricky part of the word. We might use spelling voices in there for words that might get elisions, where you might lose a syllable. These are things that should be taught. These are effective, but they ultimately, morphology, when we get onto these longer words, we start to find morphology is more of a driving factor in the spelling progress. But it's still worth saying to children, and we all do it. We do it for lots of words. Wednesday is the big one, but there's lots of words that we, even as adults, we do these spelling voices, and those are still useful to teach children. But there is more to the language than just that, and that's what we need to get to. Okay, so here's some examples from my personal practice. I made these myself, and there's a QR code that I'll hover on in case you want to scan it with a phone or anything, and it'll take you to these activities. They're aimed at the phonological, the phonics side of spelling, and the orthographic patterns. Where do we use which letters and why? They're designed to target those areas, not the morphological side of things, which we have a different program that we use for that. But I'll share these. So these are kind of some of the earlier kind of sounds that children will be getting exposed to. There's opportunities to handwrite them, say the sounds and handwrite. They can say the sounds and write them. We're trying to integrate the writing at all points. There's opportunities for them to get more automatic with their reading and recognize those patterns. And then a different sound over here, we'd be looking at the ch and how that can be spelled in different ways. So this is just a little example of some of the sheets. Unjumbling the sound, so saying the word match slowly and then writing it out by unjumbling the graphemes over here. Segmenting the sounds here, so we're trying to match up, in fetch we would have ch, and we would want them to think which of these letters are spelling which of these sounds. So we're helping to make that generalizability to new words more obvious, and also help those spellings to be filed in those little filing cabinets that I was talking about. So here's a little example here of maybe some confusable sounds when children are just learning their phonics sounds. I've put some in there where they likely get confused between the th and the f. If you can hear that on the camera, that on the microphone, that is. And then this one here is trying to encourage children to see where are we more likely to see some of these spellings appearing, and it helps them to just practice and consolidate some of the spellings that they've had. I've also got bits in there where you can look at how the meaning ties in, and we're trying to pull that semantic lever as well of looking at the sounds and the meaning and the spelling all together. So here's a couple of examples. So I've got the vowel sounds where they'll have opportunities to practice them in isolation, reading them, writing them, and then also starting to look at where we might, starting to draw out some of these patterns of where we might see certain spellings of the sounds appearing. And then also this box along the bottom here is for jailing those words that will have a different sound spelling correspondence than we might think. So we're drawing in some of those trickier parts of the language, like said in this example does not have the same sound in it as the rest of these words, so it would go in jail. So we're encouraging children to really read these out loud and say them out loud and think about the phonology and how that relates to the sounds and segment them into the boxes. So similarly here we have an activity bringing in the meaning on this one, and then looking at bringing it all together, which spelling would complete the words, and giving them practice. I've also got some that I did more recently on some of the more tricky consonant spellings, so like PH spelling in Greek words, and pulling all these kind of trickier spellings together and helping them to notice some of those patterns, providing opportunities for us to have these discussions about where we might see some of these spellings more often than others. And then a similar kind of thing here. Okay, so you'll find those on this QR code. Hopefully I tried it and it worked for me, but there should be, in that file, there should be PDFs in there that you'll just be able to click and print. And then I've included some Word documents as well in case you'd like to customize them a little bit. I'll just leave that on there in case anybody is grabbing their phone. I shared these on the NI Teachers Collaborate page a while ago. Some of you might have used them, but yeah, feel free to use them and adapt them and ask any questions if needed. But I found them very useful personally, and I just kind of got sick of scouring the internet looking for resources that didn't have loads of fluff in them and things that I thought were just holding children back. I just wanted to get straight to the good stuff, and make sure that they were doing activities that I knew aligned with a lot of the research. Okay, so I'm going to have a little whiz through some of what we might do beyond that. So beyond those phonics foundations and tying up the spelling with the phonics, we want to be building on the morphology, etymology, the history of the words. They can be very useful as well. I'm not going to talk about it loads today. So we can look at words like doing and do's. The sound changes, but we see these same conventions happening in other words. So we start to see that meaning, and these jobs that these letters are doing, explaining some of these trickier parts of the language when the when phonics basically fails us, there is usually a reason as to why. And the more we learn, I was talking to Peter, who spoke to you at the beginning, and Geraldine and Oliver, and saying that we're at the start of a journey, and it's exciting to learn these things. I found it really fascinating. The more you learn, the more that um, enthusiasm rubs off onto the children, and you want to make sense of the language and they want to make sense of it, and it's actually really fascinating as you learn more about it. So we're at the start of that journey, and hopefully as everything rolls out, we get more knowledgeable, people will find this as interesting as I do. So we are looking at, this is a bit of a graph that's designed to show that things aren't that clean, but we will ultimately be looking at the sounds a lot more, and there will be some morphology, looking at how cats and dogs sound different initially. That kind of stuff is in good instruction. There is some morphology, but it's heavily driven by our phonics. So spelling should be heavily aligned with that phonics. But as we get older, we should see children will be encountering more and more unfamiliar words, and these will be polysyllabic, multisyllabic, bigger words, and they will have advanced morphological structures. And as we study these, we will be able to spell them better. So morphology is powerful, and we looked at this earlier on, but it needs these foundations in there to really reap the most rewards, in my opinion. These are some of the things we might want to be looking at within our morphological instruction, teaching children how this is called morphological awareness. We hear of phonological awareness, phonemic awareness in phonics. This is teaching children to understand the morphemes that are in the words, be able to deconstruct them, analyze those morphemes and what they mean, understand how these change word meanings, and then actually apply and use this in their reading, spelling, and helps them to learn vocabulary. Again, I talked a lot about that at the Literacy Symposium. So if you're new to this kind of thing, there are two. This is kind of the affix-centric approach is one that's more common. We learn, lots of different ways of adding to bases, shun and re and un and that kind of thing. All these affixes, and they're very, very useful. But we can also consider base-centric, where we look base-centric instruction to morphology, where we look at actually what's the core meaning of these words, and how do the prefixes and suffixes actually affect that core meaning. And there is research. There's not a lot of research, but there is research. Bowers is a big name in the field of morphology, and they found that actually when we focus on the core meaning of the word and how these affixes, prefixes and suffixes, how do they change the meaning, we actually get better results. But there is also, in my opinion, a lot we should be still teaching these affixes separately as well. So there's benefit to both. But basically, they're saying that these morphological approaches have very strong results in both ways. But maybe we should be looking at putting the core meaning of these words at the heart of our morphological instruction. In order to do that, children need to know how to build words. This is really essential. Knowing when do we double consonants, that CVC in single syllable words is a key signaling factor to when we would double the last consonant. When do we drop E's? When do we change I to Y to an I? Sorry. These are really key. If you're going to study morphology with children and they're going to dive into this stuff, which I'm hoping more and more of the country will be persuaded to do because it's very powerful, they need to know how words are structured, especially when they get onto the more advanced aspects of morphology that are really rich and fascinating. But they need these basics in there. They will obviously, it's good to do some explicit instruction on these kind of, this is stuff that I see taught very often anyway, but they need to be very strong with these, and they'll get more practice as they explore morphology as well. So these are some of the activities you might come across if you start thinking, yeah, I think we want to go down that route of actually exploring morphology and putting maybe a base at the center of our instruction, along with teaching the prefixes and suffixes that we do at the moment. You might encounter word webs, good ways of showing word families, word sums, helping children to understand where those morphological boundaries are, and they can practice making these. They can go the other way as well. They can break words like unhelpful into their morphemes. It helps them to understand how those units contribute to meaning. And then morpheme matrices, which I've got a bigger example here. These are really powerful, and they can get very, very big. and fancy and actually very interesting from an adult point of view. But we can dive into some of these aspects that children maybe don't notice that are really powerful for spelling, but also vocabulary development. We would probably, without thinking about it, know that spectacles, to spectate, we know it's to do with looking, but actually these can take a while for these things that may be quite obvious when you think about them to actually come to the forefront unless they're explicitly taught. The more children are taught these, the more they're going to notice these patterns, the better they're going to be, through their own reading exposure at noticing these things as well. So these are a big positive that I'm very, very keen on using in my classroom. This guy here is you're looking more P6, P7 confident spellers will get a lot from this. Looking at how prefixes can actually they explain a lot of some of the trickier parts of our language, and they can change. So prefixes can change over time, and this is because a lot of them were hard to say. So the word apply once upon a time would have been apply. But over time, as that's been said, often it's changed in sound, and then the spelling in this situation has changed to remove the original spelling of the prefix. These can be really, really powerful beyond that layer of looking at more morphological matrices, word matrices. They can actually explain a lot of the tricky parts that even as adults we can sometimes get a bit confused. Is this, is it a double F, a double P, a double T? Sometimes we get a bit confused. And when we actually look, let's take an example here, like in responsible, meaning not responsible, we can see that the N has assimilated, it's changed to an R, but that explains why there are two R's there. The responsible meaning at its core has been changed by the prefix in, and understanding that is still carrying that meaning actually helps them to remember, is that one R or is that two R's? Same with illegal, not legal. Understanding that was a prefix that they will know, meaning not, like in incomplete. Knowing that will help them to remember it's not just a string of letters, there is meaning to support that. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here. I've talked long enough, I think, on this. I've not got much time for questions. So phonics and explicit instruction, they give them the tools to understand the language. The text experience is vital, though, in helping them get enough experience to see these patterns that we have picked up on over the years. But we can accelerate that if we give them the right instruction along the way. So we want to kind of move away from just cramming, getting them to practice words over and over again in 1 week. Oh, there's a naughty Z in there. Oops, sorry. Getting them to memorize these words without really thinking about their structure, just copying them over and over again, and using these isolated lists that don't have much structure, that don't highlight the language. We want to try and space practice out a little bit, give children more time to revisit things again and again, which is part of the science of learning that you'll also be learning about elsewhere. We want to be using what we know about orthographic mapping to combine the spellings with the sounds, with the meanings. We want to be testing them often on spellings, giving them a chance to retrieve them again and again. Don't teach until they remember it. Teach until they can't forget it is one of the mottos I like to use. And then structuring in morphological families or other patterned families, that's how we should be organizing any kind of instruction if we're still wanting to use things like spelling lists, things like that. Make sure that they have those structures. So make sure that phonics is really strong early on, because it is the foundation for all of this more advanced stuff that I was talking about there. Do teach all these layers. Phonics alone will not explain the whole language. So we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of what it can and can't explain and adjust our practice accordingly. But make sure we do give children those layers, not just throw words at them and hope that they pick up, how spelling works. Give them lots of opportunity to practice. Reading is huge for spelling, as we talked about early on, but also the other way around, getting children to practice these spellings a lot, giving them opportunities to retrieve them is also vital. So yeah, the combination of all these phonics knowledge and these other layers of the language all combining together is what we're aiming for and what will really make a big impact on spelling outcomes.